Must you continue to conquer? Continue to kill?
Yes.
Edelgard. She's definitely one of the units that we have in the series, for sure. I don't want to say one way or the other because regardless of which side I take, it's not going to be good. But that aside, she is very popular, and whether it's because she's very liked or because she's very infamous, it's hard to say. But I think when it came to the beginning of 2020, she definitely wasn't the most liked, or at least the most welcomed, especially when it came to our anniversary event in the Hero Rises event. For those who aren't familiar with a Hero Rises, it was initially started back in 2018 for the anniversary of the game, where you would get a free unit based on accumulated vote totals. So it started as a regular poll where the unit who got the most votes won, basically similar to CYO events. There weren't any caveats, nothing of the sort. It was literally just may the best man win. And as a result, we ended up getting a free legendary Ike through a Xenolog in the Paralogs category, and I think you can still get him. The following year, they did skip a Hero Rises, and if I remember correctly, they did the Find and Vote event in place of it, but we all know how well that went. And if you want a bit of a history on that, there's a video on it in the video description, so go check that out if you're interested. But we went back to a Hero Rises in 2020. But rather than it being a best man win scenario, it ended up becoming a top 8 poll, where the top 8 units ended up going into a voting gauntlet. And this meant that there were a lot more opportunities for other units to have a chance. So rather than just like the super popular broken unit to make it in, you could always get those side characters that may not be as good or as demanded, and they would still have as much of a chance going into it. And that's where Edelgard came into play, because where you had units such as Altina, New Year Alphonse, Sothis, and Legendary Leaf, although Sothis was never really good to begin with, at least for Aetherite's defense context. You had Altina, who was still a really powerful Vantage Sweeper. You had New Year Alphonse, who was one of the more powerful blue tomes that we had in the game at the time. Legendary Leaf, who also had his dual-phase Brave shtick, but also extremely high range, making him very, very threatening on Aetherite's defense. You had Winter Sothis, who I don't really remember as much, but I think she was still pretty decent because of her PRF and Sirius. And then you also had Legendary Azura, who was, even at the time, still one of the best dancers in the game, because granting additional movement is still a decent effect. You had Legendary Alm, who was the tank buster. And then you had Edelgard. And Edelgard was the one that absolutely stuck out like a sore thumb, because even when she released back in 2019, she was still really decent, because she did have a slaying guaranteed follow-up weapon, which was still pretty good. But to say she had as much value as the other units in the top 10 were concerned was a bit of a stretch, but there were easily a myriad of reasons for her placing that high to begin with. You had the recent release of Three Houses, which absolutely could have played a role in it. Three Houses was less than a year old at that point, so it made sense that units such as Edelgard, Claude, and Dimitri were going to score really, really high. Claude and Dimitri in particular scored 19th and 11th respectively, so in that case it did make some sort of sense. Even with the byleths, you had female in 12th and male in 21st, and there's no telling how many people redeemed the free male byleth that you got with Three Houses, but considering he also got 21st on top of that, is still really impressive. And I do think the release of Three Houses is what made it so demanding in the first place, because comparatively to a lot of other units at the time, I wouldn't even say they were amazing. You had Thrasyr, who was still one of the strongest Aetherite's defense units at the time, Legendary Hector and Celica, who are also really good, Loon with his Desperation for SETI effect, and so on and so forth. That being said, Edelgard wasn't exactly bad, but considering there were also a lot of other options that were way more limited and not in the normal pool, it was a bit more jarring as to why she was scoring as high. And I guess to rub a bit more salt on the wound for those who didn't want Edelgard to begin with, because I don't remember if we got midterm results like we did with the following ones, but we did get the results afterward on the accumulated vote total, and the unit in 9th place only lost by 115 votes. And that unit was Mythic Lif. And in fairness, Lif wasn't a good unit because his niche was just really, really bad in the setting of Aetherite's defense, but also he competed with the likes of Thrasyr and Duma, who were just way better mythics at the time. and probably still are, arguably. Even that aside, it was 115 votes. It was very, very close. And a lot of people weren't happy, to say the least, because now there was a good possibility that the free unit that they were going to receive was just going to be some regular 5-star that they could have easily gotten on any sort of random poll or on a focus banner that they would have shown up eventually on. And I believe this is the first time people started caring for the likes of voting gauntlets, which is hilarious in its own right, because most of the time it really doesn't matter. You really couldn't determine whether or not a unit was going to win, because it was really just luck of the draw until final hour. But even then, a lot of people were really determined to taking Edelgard down. And as a result, there was a lot, and I mean a lot, of campaigning for Legendary Leaf, because that's who she was up against at first. And by the time the voting gauntlet did come around, a lot of people were very tense, but also they were very happy when they found out that Legendary Leaf did in fact beat Edelgard round 1. Of course, after Legendary Leaf lost, and we ended up with a free Altina. And I think for the most part, people were pretty satisfied with that outcome. Both Sophists did lose round 1, which is also pretty funny, and that was really the extent of the voting gauntlet. I believe after this event, they did take into consideration that maybe it would be better that the top 4 units would qualify in some regard, and after that point, they did end up going on a banner. So even if the winner in particular wasn't to your fancy, you could still get one of the top 4 qualifying units on a banner instead. And if I remember correctly, they also came with a spark, so it wasn't too bad. And I guess to close this off, I always find it fun when the community kind of comes together in an attempt to at least accomplish something. And while taking down Edelgard may have not been the best topic per se, at least for some, I thought it was hilarious, especially when you would post memes about redeeming the Edelgard background, or just memes about her winning. That was always funny to me. But I think when a community has a set goal in mind and they work together to accomplish it, it's really fun. And in my opinion, I think this is a bit of a necessary evil. There's no telling if Lif getting in would have made him win per se, but I do think the community coming together and trying to accomplish something, on top of just setting a new precedent going forward, is pretty cool. And honestly, this was probably one of the more fun events. I know people don't really like the voting gauntlet thing because it's basically random at that point, but I do find it rather enjoyable because of the random nature of it all, in that people will come together in an attempt to at least accomplish something. Even when it comes to stuff like CYL with like maybe Tiki, for example, when everybody came together to at least get her in the first place so she would get an alt, it's kind of like that in my opinion. But after that point, anytime Edelgard entered a voting gauntlet, I'm pretty sure she lost round 1, and that just became a meme going forward in the community. And whether that was due to her inclusion in the initial Hero Rises 2020, it's hard to say, but I think this is something a lot of people aren't going to forget. And if you weren't familiar with this, then here you go.